Welcome. Thank you for joining me for another walk through Scripture. We're in Acts chapter 10, and today's lesson is pretty interesting. We're going to talk about the conversion process that takes place even after you've become a Christian. And as we look at this story, I hope you'll see the things that I'm saying, because I think there's a lot more to this story than we often give it credit for. Acts chapter 10, the first part, I've entitled it Crossing the Line because a major shift is about to take place in the early church. And this story is just prepping all of us for it. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. About the ninth hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, "Cornelius." And he stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send a man to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He's lodging with one Simon a tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel spoke to him had departed, he called two of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on his housetop about the sixth hour to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens open up and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals, and reptiles, and birds of the air. There came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once into heaven. Now while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean, behold, the men who were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry for Simon's house, stood at the gate and called out to ask whether Simon, who is called Peter, is lodging here. While Peter was pondering the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them." And Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" And they said, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright, God-fearing man, who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." So he invited them in to be his guests. Well, there's a lot going on in this story. You have this Roman centurion sending people because an angel talked to him. And a centurion was one who had 100 men under him. He was an officer. And he gets this vision from this angel. And so he sends his men there. And it's interesting even to see the way they introduce themselves. And they talk about Cornelius, and they talk about how he's a God-fearing man. You see, they understand that it's really strongly forbidden for Jews to enter a Gentile house, and that this invitation itself is a violation of basic Jewish culture or kosher laws. And so there's a whole lot going on here, because the Old Testament law had a whole lot to do with unclean and clean, what they could eat, what they couldn't eat, what types of wounds would make you unclean. And they had strict teaching on what you had to do if something unclean touched something that was clean, it all became unclean, and you had to go through purification rites. You had to do all sorts of things to make things clean again. This was a big deal in the Mosaic Law. And in fact, it was such a big deal that when the priests forgot to teach these things, or when they neglected to teach what was clean and unclean, and the people started violating it, God sent prophets to rebuke them. We have an example of that in Ezekiel, where the prophets or the priests are being rebuked by the prophet. And God is telling Ezekiel to tell them they are to teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, show them to distinguish between the unclean and the clean. This was a big deal to the Jewish mindset. This was a major part of the Mosaic Law. And so it was important that they all understood what was clean and unclean, common versus holy. Holy means unusual, different. And so this was a big deal. But in this story, and this is what's so interesting about this story, God is starting to redefine what it means to be clean and unclean, what it means to be holy and common. God is starting to change the traditional or the Mosaic law understanding of what that means. He shows Peter this vision that redefines what foods can be eaten and not eaten. And he's taking Peter to a place that defines what people should be considered clean or unclean. And it's going to change everything for these early Jewish Christians. You see, God put the people of Israel where he did to establish a holy priesthood. The whole idea of God having his people was to have them show the rest of the world who he was, what it was like, the benefits of having a relationship with God. And again, the nation of Israel and even Judea were never what you would call superpowers. They were never in a position to dominate the world. They just happened to be geographically located in the middle of the major empires of the world. You had Egypt to the south, and you had Babylon and Assyrians and the Hittites, and all trade between those great nations had to come through Israel. And it was in this way that God planned to influence the rest of the world, to show the rest of the world who God is and the benefits of having a relationship with God. That was the whole point of Israel being placed where it was and for them being God's people. He wants his people to be unusual, special, set apart, set aside, holy. That's what holy means. It doesn't mean a bunch of people who are arrogant looking down their noses at people. That's sort of what's come to happen, the holier than thou kind of attitude. But that's not what God intended. God wanted us just to be different enough, just to be special and unusual enough that it would create a curiosity, a holy curiosity that would draw people into saying, what's different about you? And the answer is our relationship with God. And if that was attractive, it would draw them also into a relationship with God. That was the whole point. If the world sees the advantages of having a relationship with God and its benefits, it will be drawn in to the community of God, which is what we want all people of the entire earth to do. It has to do with your spiritual orientation. How do you view yourself, your relationship with God, and therefore your relationship with everyone else? You see, the purpose of holiness, as we've been talking about, is to draw people towards that relationship with God. But the Jews of Jesus' day, and even before that, had twisted that around, had gotten that whole message turned upside down. That they sort of saw themselves as God's favorites, as God's pet people, and that everyone else should be condemned. Everyone else was going to hell, and they didn't seem to care. They were just worried about their own salvation. They were only worried about their own relationship with God, and they had no desire to mix with the other nations, to share the message with the other nations. If those people came in and asked, they might explain it to them. But otherwise, they were just sort of kept to themselves. They turned inward and rejoiced that they were going to be saved, but showed very little concern for other people. And that allowed them to look down on all the other people. And I don't know if you've ever been looked down on, but that's not an attractive message. That's not an attractive place to be. When you feel like others are looking down on you, you're not drawn to them. You actually want to avoid them. And that's very understandable. So what God is working here is what we would term a paradigm shift. This is a whole different picture. Things are changing. Things are going in a different direction. And that's what's happening here. You see, the early Jewish Christians didn't really understand, I think initially, they didn't understand Christianity as a new religion. They saw it as sort of a Judaism 2.0. The whole Old Testament talked about a Messiah. To them, the Messiah came. They recognized the Messiah, and they followed the Messiah. And so the issue now is whether you recognize Jesus as the Messiah or not. But they didn't necessarily, they saw this as a fulfillment of Judaism, not necessarily as a new religion. And since that's the way they saw it, they pretty much kept to themselves even after they became Christians. They only spoke to other Jews about the Messiah. They weren't real thrilled about the idea of going elsewhere. And so we've seen just slowly that Philip went up and talked to the Samaritans. Philip talked to the Ethiopians. That things are starting to open up a little, but there's still a major barrier to be crossed, and that is talking to the Gentiles. It's going to take a major push to get them to break out of that cultural comfort zone. They saw a lot of their own religious purity tied up in avoiding contact with the Gentiles. I almost get the feeling that's one of the reasons God put them under Roman captivity. The fact that the Romans were in charge forced them to actually interact with Gentiles on a regular basis, even though they tried to avoid it as much as possible. So we're going to deal with radical changes. You see, Peter's in Joppa, and I think it's significant because there's another biblical character who was also in Joppa, who had also been asked to preach to Gentiles. And just to show you how your average Jew thought about preaching to Gentiles, we have the story of Jonah in the Bible. God comes to him, tells him he needs to go to Nineveh, a Gentile city. The people were known for their depravity. They were known for their viciousness and their warrior-like nature. And God tells Jonah to go preach to Nineveh. And Jonah goes to Joppa and takes a fast boat going the other direction. He's trying to get away from preaching to the Gentiles in Nineveh. Peter might have had some of these same thoughts. And being in Joppa, he was conveniently located. But we saw what happens when God tells you to go preach and you try to run the other direction. Jonah ends up getting swallowed by a whale, spit out 3 days later, and still ends up going to preach to the Gentiles of Nineveh. Peter's a little more spiritually savvy, I think. He understands something's going on here, and he's going to be a little more open to the idea of preaching to Gentiles. But initially, with this vision of these clean and unclean animals, he thinks God's checking his Jewish purity. He thinks God's maybe testing him on whether he knows the Mosaic law, whether he can tell the difference between the clean and the unclean, the holy and the common. He thinks God's testing him there, and he replies very quickly, "No, I've never touched any of this stuff." But then he gets the strange answer. What God has called clean, do not call unclean. And this happens 3 times. This seems to be a magic number for Peter. We all remember that he denied Jesus 3 times when the rooster crowed. After the resurrection, Jesus asked him, "Peter, do you love me?" And he says, you know I do. And he says, feed my sheep. And he does that 3 times to where Peter finally gets a little frustrated. And now we have this vision, this vision of this sheet of animals being lowered and going through this exchange with God happens 3 times. I think that probably rung a bell in Peter's mind and certainly in his spirit that there's something significant happening here. That after 3 times he knows he'd better think about this and learn what he's supposed to learn. He would probably like to avoid getting swallowed by a whale. So he's going to try to figure it out. And what's God's actually doing here is going to check his cultural flexibility, which for a Jew had a lot of theological implications as well. So you can see why there might be an uncomfortableness about this shift that's about to happen. It's not just cultural, it's also religious. God's trying to change the paradigm. So what's going on here? You see, he's trying to get Peter to look at the world differently. He knows in Peter's current condition, he will not be very effective at sharing the gospel with Gentiles. And so he's got to get Peter to see the world differently so that he can reach people in a different cultural context for the sake of the gospel. Now, I think most of us understand if you do mission work, if you go to a foreign country, you have an idea that things are going to be a little different. I grew up in Japan because my parents were missionaries. The Japanese sing, their understanding of music is different. Their understanding of worship is a little different. The way they see reverence, the way honor plays in their society, it's a very different culture. And missionaries have to approach them differently. They don't change the message about Jesus, but they change the methods and the means by which they share that message. My wife and I then spent 10 years working in Kenya, East Africa. And, Africans are very, very different than the Japanese or Americans. Their worship services were a lot longer. The way they sang, the way they have to move while they're singing. You couldn't sit down and sing in Kenya. You had to stand up, you had to clap your hands, and you had to move while you were singing. That's just the way they do it. It's different, but it's not wrong. It's just different. And so God's telling Peter, you got to see the world differently. You got to accept the world as it is, and you need to deal with different cultural context in order to share the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we get that if we go to a different country, mostly. I've seen some missionaries that don't. But for the most part, you understand, if you went to a different country, you would. Paul, probably a decade or more later, puts it this way: I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. This is the attitude that God's trying to get Peter to shift to. And he's going to make the shift, but we read in Galatians that many years later, Peter is still struggling with that we find that in a place where Jews came and visited him in Antioch, that Peter actually separates himself from the Gentiles, quits fellowshipping with them so he can keep kosher rules with the other Jewish Christians. And according to Galatians, Paul says, I had to rebuke him to his face in front of everybody. And that what ensues is the Jerusalem conference, which we'll get to in a few weeks. But it's interesting that this is a struggle it was an ongoing struggle. And I don't know if you've ever had those situations where you know what's right, but you have a hard time putting it into practice. And that's what's going to go on here. You've got to become missional. I remember coming back from Kenya and recognizing that the younger generations were very different. I'm on the tail end of the baby boomers. I came back and was confronted by a whole lot of Gen Xers. And then this whole new group, this new generation of millennials. And they were different. And I started realizing if the church is going to survive even here in America, we're going to have to take a missional approach. We're going to have to understand a new culture and learn to present the gospel in different ways. See, God's telling Peter, you've got to become a missionary. You've got to approach sharing the gospel like a missionary would. Learn the language of the other culture, learn the customs and values of the other culture, and then craft the message of the gospel in means that that culture will understand. That's critical to any mission work. The trick here is it's happening right here in our own country, just like it was happening right there in his own country. Here's Peter, grew up in Nazareth, grew up around the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum, and he's used to this culture. This is his country, and he's learned how to act in it. But now God's telling him, I want you to share the gospel with Romans, the people that you probably grew up hating, the conquering nation that controlled your country and was the blame of all things evil. And God's telling him, I want you to go and preach the gospel not just to any Gentile, but to a Roman centurion who had become a God-fearer, a God worshiper. And so Peter's having to shift his cultural understanding, his cultural paradigm, his view of the world in his own country. And that has to be a little weird, but that's what God's calling all of us to do. That even within our own country, the cultures change. We're surrounded by multiculturalism. Churches are constantly finding themselves in the middle of a ethnically changing neighborhood. And as so many do, they simply sell and move out when instead, maybe, God's calling them to learn the culture that's moving in around them and preach the message of the gospel to them as well. But we certainly need to be aware of the changing culture in the generations, as well as the changing cultures in our neighborhoods, and learn to preach the gospel. Don't change the message of the gospel, but change the methods and the means by which we share it so that they can hear it better and have a chance to join the community of God with us. So what's the call to action here? Many people look at this and they say, oh, this is about the conversion of Cornelius, but that's not what this first section's about. We're going to get to the conversion of Cornelius in the next couple of chapters. This is about the ongoing conversion of Peter. You say, what do you mean, Daniel? When we're converted, we're converted. Well, that in biblical terms, that's not true. That we're in process. We are saved. We are being saved. And we will be saved. We're transformed when we give our lives to Jesus. We're continuing to be transformed. And ultimately, we will be completely transformed when we enter heaven and praise God around the throne of God. So the conversion process is just that. It's a process. It's not a one-time thing. You can't just point to one event and say, well, that's where I was converted, because it's a process. And we see that right here with Peter. Peter's been converted to Jesus. That's why he started following him. That's when Jesus said, who do you say that I am? He said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the Christian confession of faith, is that we believe Jesus is the Son of God. But then Peter had to get converted to the church as well. He was a follower of Jesus. But we find after he's rejected Jesus 3 times, Jesus questions him, as we talked about earlier. Do you love me? Are you converted to me, Peter? And Peter says, yes. And he said, well, then feed my sheep. I need you to be converted to the people of the church as well. I need you to be converted to the community that we are building here. That it's not enough just to follow Jesus. You need to be converted and become a part of the community of God. You need to encourage, exhort, teach, share, rejoice with, mourn with the community, the church, the fellowship of Jesus Christ, not just following Jesus. But then there's a third step, and that's what we're talking about this morning. You've got to be converted to the Gentiles, to the outsiders, for the sake of the kingdom of God. In my years in experience, I've seen a lot of churches make the same mistake that the first century Jews had made. They turned inward. They didn't care about anyone else. They were only focused on their own salvation. They weren't concerned about the salvation of the lost world around them. And it's very easy to fall into that trap. I've seen a lot of places do it. We look through history. The story of Jonah is about the Jewish people doing that hundreds of years before Christ. They were still doing it at the time of Christ. And I fear that there's a lot of Christians who are still making that mistake, that their focus turns inward. It's all about our fellowship and about having friends and meeting with other Christians, and we sort of forget to reach outsiders for the sake of Jesus Christ. Oh, sure, if they stumble into our building and happen to come in and ask us some questions, we'll answer them. But are we really going out and sharing the message of Jesus Christ with those who are outside our fellowship? And I think that's the call of action. We need to understand that's part of the conversion process. And so the question for you this morning, this time is, where are you at in that conversion process? I assume if you're listening to this message that perhaps you're converted to Jesus, that you're interested in following Jesus. Are you a part of a church? Are you an active part of a Christian fellowship? Because that's critical in the conversion process. If you think you just have a personal relationship with Jesus and that's all that's necessary, you haven't read the scriptures very carefully. This is a critical part of our relationship with Jesus, is having a relationship with the community of God. But there's a third element in here that I think gets overlooked quite often, is that conversion to the outsiders, conversion to the Gentiles, the paradigm shift to get us to recognize Jesus died for everyone, not just those of us within our fellowship. That he died for everyone and they need to hear the message, and he's called us. He's called us to share that message. It says one plants, one waters, God gives the increase. That we're supposed to, that's our whole responsibility, is to share the message to the best of our ability in means and ways that people can understand it. And then we turn the process over to God. God then converts or doesn't. It is him who gives the increase in the process. So where are we at? Where are you at in this process? And if you're coming up short, you might want to consider this passage of Scripture. That what God has called clean, don't call unclean. Don't look down at your nose at people who aren't Christians. Recognize that God, Jesus, died for them the same way he died for you. And that the powerful message of salvation for us, the transformation that takes place when we receive the Holy Spirit through baptism, needs to be shared. When you've got good news, you need to share that good news. And that's why the gospel means what it means. Gospel literally means the good news of Jesus Christ. So throughout this next week, think about these things. Think about where you're at in this process, and maybe with Peter, let the Spirit guide you into this new area of conversion and start becoming aware of the people around you who need to hear the message of Jesus. I hope you have a blessed week.